There is a lot going on the African continent, and there's a lot going on in South Africa. In fact, our challenges here in South Africa aren't unique in the African continent at all. High youth unemployment rates are, really crippling the economy and crippling the young people of South Africa. Over and above that, the economy and just the overall standard of living has become lower. People can't afford even some loaf of bread. So what happens to the young people in those circumstances? How are they navigating their way through these various circumstances in their life? We're finding out a little bit about this from the perspective that explores the dynamic everyday life-making strategies of young men in a place called Zandspruit here in South Africa. This is a book by author Dr. Hannah Dawson that's titled Making a Life that questions the increasingly prevalent perspective that romanticizes the adaptive survival strategies of the urban poor by exploring the intricate connections between those with and those without wages. Dr. Hannah Dawson joins us on the line. Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for your time this morning. Good morning.
Morning, Palesa. Thanks very much for having me.
You know, these are not unique challenges to the young men in Zandspruit at all. A lot is happening on the African continent, but rarely do we find a place to really speak about what goes on in the lives of young people, especially young men who are going through the challenges that we're facing in this country. Speak to us a little bit about why you decided that you were going to go into Zandspruit to find out how these young men are making lives for themselves.
Yeah, so, this book is really the product of a long journey. I first began doing research in Zandspruit back in 2011, and the original impetus for the research actually was a string of political protests that were happening in Zandspruit. And at the time, a lot of the media discourse was, linking this protest activity to high levels of unemployment and, excuse me, the disgruntlement of young people. And in spending time in this community and especially getting to know those who've been very active in the protests, I began to realize that actually one couldn't make such a clear connection and began to ask a series of questions around what actually shapes young people and in particular young men's economic lives. So how are they making choices to opt in or out of often the available jobs in a place like Zandspruit are few, first of all, but often very low-end, low-paying jobs. And then in the reality that most people in Zandspruit don't have at least a stable wage job, what are the other strategies young people in particular are using to get by? And so this became a kind of 10-year long project of trying to understand much more closely how the local economy works, what matters to young people in terms of their economic choices, but their lives more broadly. And that's why the focus of the book is on what I call life making, or the strategies young men do to make a life. Because so much of the conversation about unemployment in South Africa is about a job or the absence of a job.
Yeah.
And often that conversation misses out a lot about what actually is important to young people, but actually all of us when we're trying to make lives in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in.
Absolutely, because life continues whether or not you have a job, and life is happening nonetheless, even though it might not be in the ways that are particularly, in the forefront, especially when it comes to the economy here in South Africa. Well, tell us a little bit about who these young men are that you were able to engage in and find out how they're making these lives for themselves.
Yeah, so I mean, in the book, many of the men who are the kind of core interlocutors or participants of the wider project and who are the key characters in the book, many of them were in their early 20s in 2010, 11, and 12. And now many of them are in their early to late 30s. So the book is also a story about, being a young person is not about being stuck in time. But as you said, life continues irrespective of if you acquire the job you want or life works out in the way in which you desire it to. But in the book, I do draw a contrast between young people to show how different life choices pan out over time. So some of the important distinctions in the book are between, someone that had finished matric or someone who didn't. That's an important distinguishing factor.
Yeah.
You know, someone that is between 18 and 23 and 24, they're often a little bit more optimistic about the kind of economic opportunities, especially in the formal sector, that might open up. Whereas someone who's been trying to, make a life and has often moved in and out of low-wage jobs in the formal sector, who's now 30 or 35, has a very different understanding about how actually they think they could best shape their own lives and where the more economic opportunities might arise. And then another important distinction in the book is also between, someone that grew up in Zandspruit or moved to Zandspruit as a child or a teenager, and much of Zandspruit's population is also migrants from other parts of the country and also other parts of the continent. And all of these factors shape not just who does what kind of jobs or who sees, a low-end job in construction or in private security as valuable or not, but it also shapes who can access the more lucrative or the more profitable opportunities in the local economy. So one of the things I'm drawing attention to the book is a large part of the discussion often around the informal economy or the township economy. We focus a lot on, for example, those selling goods and foods on the side of the road. But in my book, I focus on particular spaces where men in particular, not only make money, but also are able to forge relationships and forms of meaning and connection outside of waged employment. So, one of the ones in the book that gets a lot of attention is a particular car wash stand. I also speak a lot about the local property rental market. So if someone has lived in the community a long time, you're much more likely to access rental income, but also have access to other economic opportunities that, if you just arrived last week from Zimbabwe or Limpopo province, you don't have the same connections and the same political kind of legitimacy to also engage with the local economy in the same way. And so part of the book is to show actually, if you finished school or not, or you went to university or not, these are not the only factors that shape what economic opportunities you have access to. In a place like Zandspruit, how long you've lived there, who you know or don't know, if you have property or not, these are actually these are very important factors that shape opportunities in a place like Zandspruit that we often don't pay that much attention to.
Yeah.
And that's part of what the book is trying to do, is to show how young people use the resources available to them to make what they see as the best opportunities. And sometimes that means not taking any job and rather carving out a life that involves.
Dr. Dawson, stay with us on the line. I'm really intrigued to find out what your findings were in how these young men of Zandspruit, are making a living for themselves, but also what that means for the rest of us, meaning, because there's a huge population of urban poor here in South Africa and all over the African continent. And I'm pretty sure that some of the things that you see here are things that exist in many other parts of our societies. It's 20 minutes past 10 Central Africa time. We're unpacking a really good book titled Making a Life, Young Men in Johannesburg's Urban Margins.
Africa. It's time to plug into the heartbeat of the continent. Tune in to Channel Africa, your go-to radio station that broadcasts in 5 different languages.
L'Afrique du Sud célèbre la journée nationale du
Kabla hujaitwa kwa jina la double K or more of our forests have been destroyed.
Partido Africano da Independência da Guiné.
Channel Africa represents every corner of this amazing land. From Lagos to Cape Town, Nairobi to Dakar, we've got you covered with the freshest news, music, and cultures. So, turn up the volume, feel the rhythm. And join the conversation. Channel Africa, the African perspective. On the move, weekdays, 9 a.m. to midday. Only on Channel Africa. #On the move.
This is incredibly intriguing because it speaks so much about our communities, the ones that we live in, some of us, the ones that we're from, and the ones that exist more than the communities, in fact, that we want to be a part of. This book is titled Making a Life, Young Men in Johannesburg Urban Margins, and we continue to find out more about this book with author Dr. Hannah Dawson. You went into these communities, you spoke to these young people, and you've seen the ways that they're really trying to engage with the economy in ways that I suppose the economy hasn't been kind to them in the mainstream ways. What did you find out about these young men of Zandspruit?
Yeah, so, so much. Maybe one of the ways to kind of condense some of what I do in the book is I learned over time that asking someone if they were employed or not was not a very helpful question, because sometimes someone had actually some kind of very casual, precarious job, but they didn't consider that job to be employment. It was just, a casual gig.
Or a peace job, as they call it.
A peace job, yeah. Although that language was sometimes used and sometimes other language was used. And other times, someone would say, no, I'm unemployed. But actually, they were hustling in a whole range of variety of ways. We're actually doing 4 or 5 had various different income strategies. And so I kind of moved away from asking this question around, if someone was in work or out of work, and rather trying to focus on how money moves. So how do young men acquire money, but also trying to understand the linkages between money as it moves within a place like Zandspruit. So in particular, how do those who earn wages outside of the settlement in jobs, how does that money enter the local economy and then move through it? So, there's the obvious ways. Most people that earn money outside need to rent, they need to access food, they want to enjoy themselves at the local shebeen, etc., etc. But in the book, I really focus on, there's one chapter where I talk about hustling strategies and something I call brokering. And hustling is trying to capture many what we might call informal economic strategies that young men, or economic activities young men, are involved in.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, in the book, I really focus on this one car wash stand because it illustrates very clearly how money moves. So, those who earn wages outside normally are getting to work via the taxi industry. And then the taxi bosses distribute income to the taxi drivers, and some of that money then gets distributed to those that run the car washes, and that money circulates even further. And often a car wash stand, even myself, I always thought of it as that's one business. But the more time I spent at a few car wash stands in Zandspruit, I realized this was rather a hub for a variety of economic activities. This was, everything from, mashonisas to the drug trade was, embedded in these same social connections. And in the book, I also focus on a number of youth-led NGOs, which often I think don't get the attention they need to, that young people are often in communities like Zandspruit involved in lots of important community work that are tapped into bigger NGOs, wider projects, or sometimes into political structures. And that these local youth-run NGOs not only provide an important space, often that young people feel is safe, a space to, spend time, to build connections, to also, they use these connections to kind of, improve their CVs and this kind of thing. But these local-run NGOs also become an important source of accessing resources, either through political parties or through bigger NGOs that are wanting to do work in local communities but don't have the local leverage. And as you said in your introduction, what's happening in Zandspruit is happening in many other parts of the continent. And I've just finished reading a book on called Hustle Urbanism in Nairobi. And really this book in Nairobi shows, it also focuses a lot on youth-run NGOs and how young people in neighborhoods like Zandspruit in Nairobi have collectively organized to basically run a whole range of services that in South Africa we would think of as the responsibility of local government. So waste collection services, sanitation services. So this is, again, another lens on which young people are often actually filling in the gaps in offering all kinds of services, which not only are often of value to the community more widely, but they also provide young people with something valuable to do and access to some resources. Of course, not the kinds of resources young people want. But nonetheless, these become very important sources of social connection, money, meaning, and connection.
So, what does this tell us about urban inequality, or maybe even, urban living for many of us? Because, as we've keep saying, this might be a little bit of, a community in Zandspruit, but this happens. I mean, as you're speaking, you're telling me about something that I know from where I'm from. It's the exact same thing. And I know in many other communities of people that I've spoken to. So many communities exist in this way. And young people have sort of given up on the formal job economy, which creates a place in our townships to really find ways to thrive, to live, and to keep growing in some way or another. How does this, what does this tell us, in fact, about South Africa? What does it tell us about the African continent? And what does it tell us about young people in these economic times?
Yeah, I mean, I think many things. I mean, on the one hand, I think it points, what I'm attending to in trying to make more visible is what those really on the edges of, we might say, our society, or the edges of the economy. So those that are seen to be excluded, and in one sense are excluded given the high levels of inequality we see in South Africa, but also in many other parts of the continent. And yet at the same time, what I'm trying to highlight in the book is actually what young people in a place like Zandspruit are able to do, despite being on the margins or on the edges. That doesn't mean we I think some questions coming out of this book are, what does it mean to radically rethink the kind of inequalities that we have? But this book is rather to take a close eye to spaces and places that we often also think of as being, we blanket, there's often, if you look at in Zandspruit, if you look up the headlines that describe Zandspruit, it's often, these blanket statements. This is a place of deprivation. This is a place of violence. This is a place of criminality. And actually completely overlooks the kind of dynamism of economic activity, the ways in which people are collectively organizing in a society in which the state is increasingly absent. But also we think of often, policymakers often think of people in a place like Zandspruit as equally poor. And so one component of the conversation that my book contributes to is that just because you live in an informal settlement doesn't mean everyone is equally poor. And so I'm also highlighting in the book important inequalities even within a place like Zandspruit. And the big distinction I draw on is the one between those who, even if it's not property with a title deed attached, but the simple distinction between if you pay rent or not is actually very important to understand how, for example, the labor market dynamics of who's willing to work for a piece job or not is not actually about personal motivation. It's much more about your position within the local economy. And I think sometimes we've also misunderstood some of these dynamics in trying to, when we hear a lot of public commentary about, who is seen to be more or less hardworking or more or less willing to do certain types of jobs. I think we're not really understanding the economy in its entirety. And that's, again, what I'm trying to draw attention to in this book, that the economy is not just the formal economy or those in waged employment. We need to think about, again, the economy in a much broader sense to understand what people do and why. And of course, in understanding the wider inequalities, which, remain pervasive, of course, in a place like South Africa.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Really intriguing conversation and, great study indeed that you looked at here, Dr. Dawson. I'm looking forward to actually reading this book and finding out about the young people of South Africa, the young people of the African continent as well, and how resilient, in fact, they are, which is something that I also see as a really big point in this particular study and book. Thank you so much for your time. Where can we find the book?
It's in, all book in South Africa, but you can also buy it online on Amazon even. So if you Google it, you'll find it, basically.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's Dr. Hannah Dawson, anthropologist and author of the book Making a Life, Young Men in Johannesburg Urban Margins.